Bag lecture series that we host with the Kearney Public Library. I want to offer my thanks to the Kearney Public Library, as always, for being our partner in these. We've been doing these for pre-pandemic, 6, 7 years, all fuzzy. I'm not a historian, so don't trust me on dates, but have been wonderful partners in providing an outlet for our faculty, our students, and other historians in the community to kind of talk about the work that they're doing and the incredible stories that the past provides us. I also want to point you to a couple of upcoming events. First, we're kind of having a special brown bag on the 18th for those of you who were here in February to see Tatiana Moore present her research. She's going to be giving the talk again at Western Nebraska Community College on the 18th. So we'll actually be talking about the Sioux Ordnance Depot in Sydney, where the depot is located. So we're very, very excited to share that research with folks in Western Nebraska. We also have talks scheduled now for June. Dr. Amber Alexander, who's with us today, is going to be discussing neighbors and conflicts, civilian participation through Nebraska's World War II Army airfields. So what were the reactions and the responses from local communities when these military installations suddenly got dropped around the state? So it'll be a really fascinating talk. And then in July, I'm sorry, it's me again, and we'll be talking about the Explorer 1 balloon, which was an Army Corps of Engineers and National Geographic aviation expedition to try to reach the stratosphere for the first time and survive, and it exploded and crashed outside Loomis. So we'll talk about, but thankfully all three of the balloonists did survive. But it's the centennial commemoration of that event. There will also be later in July an unveiling of a historical marker outside Loomis commemorating this crash as well. So for those, we have a lot of activities going on campus and elsewhere. So please stay in touch. We've got the requisite social media profiles. Look in the hub, look at UNK News, and elsewhere. And then there's also a sign-up list for event emails at the back of the table. Now, what we do is support students. Student research, student scholarships and things, and so if you've been impressed with our students and you've been impressed with what they've been able to accomplish, we welcome any support, and so there's a QR code here and then at the back of the room that takes you to the University Foundation, how you can support UNK history students and public history students as well. So today, I am our speaker. I am Dr. Nathan Tye, the Assistant Professor of Nebraska and American West History here at UNK. And I study many, many things and am very involved in many of our wonderful community museums and historical institutions. The G.W. Frank Museum, Buffalo County Historical Society, Japanese Hall at the Lake City of Plains Museum in Gering, which will be opening on June 8th, and have given talks and published on a myriad of things. But today we're going to talk about something a little more gruesome than my usual lectures. And this one, I just want to warn everybody, it is graphic. There are not graphic images, okay, but there are graphic descriptions of crimes, of murders, of violence against animals. Stephen Dee Richards is not a good human being, as you're going to learn. But this is an important story about early Buffalo County, about early Kearney County. It is something that kind of remained in local lore through the 20th century. And there's much remaining to kind of tell with this story, as we'll talk about at the end. I actually would love to enlist your support to find some things that are related to this trial and this man that may or may not be floating around the community yet. But today, I want to highlight, as the title suggests, the crime and times of Stephen Dee Richards. His violence captivated the state during the second full decade of homesteading and colonization, a period that tested the nascent legal system and its law enforcement arm. Richards committed gruesome crimes in Nebraska and Iowa as well, murdering 9 men, women, and children. His crimes, an unprecedented confession, transfixed the nation and endured in local lore well into the 20th century. There were folks who had been witnesses to these crimes living through the 1940s, who vividly recollected what happened, and we're going to rely on some of their memories to help us piece together the story today. Now, Stephen Dee Richards here Worked under a number of names: William Hudson, F.A. Hogue, Gallagher. Contemporary press accounts deemed him the Nebraska monster and claimed the peculiarities of this prince of murderers are well worthy the study of a scientist. Richards was a large man for his era, 170 pounds and 6'3". A commentator found that, quote, at prison he was generally pretty regarded a handsome man, though his features were too coarse for that. His eyes were steel gray, almost blue, very keen and penetrating, and withal restless and suspicious. And we can kind of see that in the photos here. The photo on the left, which is held at the State Historical Society in Lincoln, is of a much younger Richards, and then the photo on the right is much later, and the current location of that photo is unknown. Richards was born in Wheeling, Virginia in 1856, so this is before West Virginia leaves Virginia during the Civil War. As a child, his family moved to neighboring Ohio. His parents, as he recalled, were not strict, but mother used her influence over me as a Christian woman, and I regularly attended Sunday school. But he also does not say a single thing about his father, which is one of the many curiosities about him. Only about his mother, but she died when he was 15 years old, and he recalls that I was a little wild at times and sometimes attended dances and other evening entertainments, but did nothing positively wrong there. Yet in his confession, he also shares something that indicates what is to come. When I was a boy, I was sent out to kill a litter of kittens. And I did it by striking their heads against a tree, smashing out their brains one by one. I didn't feel bad about it at all. It was fun. I experienced the same sort of feeling when I killed these little Harlson kids just as soon as strangled so many kittens or brained them against a tree. Lovely human being. As a young man, Richard worked around farms and others in Ohio and became engaged to a young woman by the name of Anna Milhorn. Soon, though, he began engaging in criminal activities. As he shares with us, I opened correspondence with a number of bad men in the West. I also began passing counterfeit money, which he had purchased in New York City. In 1876, he headed west looking for opportunities, first stopping in Illinois, across the river from Burlington, Iowa, and stayed briefly with William Lee, a local brothel owner, who was later hung for murdering one of the sex workers in his employ. He then found work as an attendant at the Iowa Lunatic Asylum in Mount Pleasant, but soon took up, quote, tramping the state in regular style and passed through Kansas City, Hastings, Nebraska, and the 3-year-old community of Kearney Junction. 2 weeks into his time in Kearney, he killed his first victim. Riding north, he met another man south of town. As darkness fell, they set up camp between Dobytown, a small community west of the remnants of Fort Kearney. This is a map of Dobytown here. For those who have driven out to Fort Kearney State Historical Park, there is a historical marker where Dobytown is. This is a map that was drawn by the daughter of one of the few remaining residents of Dobytown, and the state highway goes right through the middle of it. The pair played cards around a campfire, quote, and I won nearly all the stranger had, Richard says. Angered, the stranger accused Richards of cheating and brought it up again as they headed to Kearney in the morning. Either give me back my money or fight, he reportedly told Richards. A fight ensued, and Richards shot the man above the left eye. After killing him, I dragged him down to the Platte River and pitched him in. He then took the victim's horse, traded it for another in Kearney, and went south to Phelps County until things cooled down. Now, mind you, this is the Platte River in this period. This is an Army map from 1866. So now, depending on the season, depending on, winter runoff usage in Colorado and irrigation, there's not much water in the Platte River. But in this period, it is a mile wide and a foot deep. And you can see the amount of islands and sandbars and the difficulty traversing this. But this is also a place where you could dump a body and someone might not find it. Which, when he comes back into Kearney after shooting this first man, he meets another stranger near the river who inquired about his friend. Spooked, Richard shot the man in the back and then threw his body in the river. So again, he's only been here for a little over a month and he's already murdered 2 people, really making a strong impression on the community. Afterwards, he headed for Kearney again and stopped at the Harlson family homestead outside town. There he chatted with Jasper Harlson and his wife Mary, who asked him if he'd been in a fight. I asked her why she asked me that question, and she replied that there was blood on my shirt bosom and collar. I did not know it and was startled, but remarked in a joking way that it must have been the blood of some of the men I had murdered. The subject was then dropped. Richards did not stay around town and presumably changed his shirt, we can only imagine, traveling further west to Cheyenne and all other communities along the Union Pacific Railroad. I do not remember what I did in Cheyenne, but I passed the time particularly with the boys, and I think that I had my share of fun. Then Richards moved on to Kansas City, determined to reform, and found farm work outside the city. Soon, though, he was on the road again to Iowa, where he bought a stranger's buggy and horses with counterfeit money outside Cedar Rapids. The next day, when the seller discovered that the cash was faked, he confronted Richards, who promptly shot him and buried the body and fled to Lincoln, with the intent of going back to Kearney. As he rode west to Kearney, he was joined by a young man named Gemge, G-E-M-G, lovely name. When southwest of town, near the present-day community of Lowell, the pair got in a fight when Richards awoke his companion to continue their trip into town. He shot Gemge through the head and presumably disposed of the body in the Platte River. So we're now at a body count of 3 in Buffalo and Kearney County and 1 in Iowa. Back in town, he registered at a local hotel under the assumed name of F.A. Hogue and was briefly jailed on suspicion of murder, one in which he was unconnected, and he was soon released. He remained in the area and was arrested again in June of 1878 for larceny. There he reconnected with Mary Harlson, the woman who had asked him about his bloody clothing, who was also in the county jail on suspicion of aiding in her husband's escape from that very jail. While detained, the pair agreed to a financial arrangement. Richards would purchase the Harlson homestead for $600 when it was proved up in 6 months. And upon release, Richards found work in the area and eventually paid Harlson the $600 and moved in with the family in October of 1878. And he was able to do this because Jasper Harlson, the husband, had abandoned the family. Jasper had been imprisoned in the Buffalo County Jail for stealing wood on the Buffalo County, or on the bridge that went over the Platte River. And Richards later confessed to providing the tools to Jasper to get out of the jail. So he's really found a cohort of really wonderful people in early Buffalo County to hang with, and he had stolen, this wood off the bridge, which, mind you, wood is a really precious commodity in this time period. This is well before Arbor Day. This is well before a lot of the tree planting that provides things, and we have a sense of what that bridge looks like. These are the original blueprints for the first bridge over the Platte River from 1874. They're in the collections at the Buffalo County Historical Society at the Trails and Rails Museum, and at the very bottom it does say Kearney Junction. So at some point, some of this bridge was stolen, which then further ingratiates Richards into the Harlson family. Now, the Harlsons were locally considered a bad crowd. Jasper was a no-account sort of fellow, and his wife was a little better, though she was a shrew woman, a great talker, and very inquisitive. And Jasper Harlson, who disappears from the scene, is, of the folks involved in this case, immediately involved in this case, one of the longest lives. He actually dies in 1930 in Oklahoma. The Harlston homestead was typical from the period, a 2-room sod house, which this is a Solomon Butcher photo of a comparable sod house from just a couple of years later to kind of give us a sense of what this would be. There was one room with 2 beds and a crib where everyone slept, and then the other was the kitchen. There were 4 people at the home: Mary, the mother, and her 3 children: Daisy, age 10, Mabel, aged 4, and the youngest, Jesse, who was just 2. At the time of the murders, the family also had a hired man named Brown who worked at the site. Richard lived with the family from mid-October, from October 18th, until their murders on November 3rd. In the time that he shared much of his past with Mary, who read the correspondence in Richard's trunk, which included details of his crimes. So not only is she seeing the bloody clothing on him, but she also has the letters, which he is apparently talking about his counterfeiting and possibly his murdering. So when asked why he murdered, he said, first, she talked too much. Second, she was too inquisitive. Third, she would have given me away had I let her live. On the morning of the murder, Richards sent Brown, the farmhand, to the stable for his chores while he dug a grave for the family. Picking up an axe placed near the door, he went about his horrid business. He murdered the mother, Mary, first, then the 2 children sleeping beside her, before killing the final child. All were asleep, none stirred as he dispatched them, recalled Richards. Within 30 minutes, he had killed the whole family. Disposed of the bodies, washed up, and then left for Hastings with the farmhand, who was absolutely unaware, going about his farm chores, that his employers and the entire family had been buried in the field. And Richards lived about the Harlson place as though nothing had occurred. And when anyone asked about Brown, he said that Brown left, and he does. He gives money to Brown, and he says, hey, you've been fired, go about. And said that the Harlsons had run off with the farmhand. But by early December, he was in need of money. He had paid the $600. He was the owner of the Harlson homestead at this point, but he still needed money. So he found work with a Swedish homesteader by the name of Peter Anderson, who lived outside the small Kearney County community of Keene, southwest of Minden. Anderson wanted him to build some sawed-out outbuildings for his homestead, and Peter was a bachelor homesteader, young, and the Anderson homestead was 5 miles from the Harlson homestead, where the bodies, mind you, are still undiscovered. While Richards worked, Anderson became sick and accused the former of poisoning him. And this is the present-day site of the Anderson homestead. I know it just looks like a nondescript site in Kearney County, but thankfully there was a young child who remembered this, and in the 1940s gave the quarter and section number of where everything happened. And so you can actually map out very, very clearly where a lot of the stuff happened. And so the Anderson homestead here, which I think I spooked the farmer who was in his field because I stopped to take photos. And didn't want to explain that there'd been a gruesome murder here sometime ago. And so while Richards worked, Anderson became sick and accused Richards of poisoning him. The two fought over dinner. Anderson reached for an axe, but Richards was quicker and grabbed a hammer, which he brought down on Anderson's head. I pushed the body one aside and sat down and ate my dinner, reported Richards. He then carried Anderson, who was still alive, into the cellar, where he finished him off and buried him beneath coal and clay. As he came upstairs, he found Anderson's neighbors peering through the windows. The neighbors left, but returned with more men and questioned Richards as to where Anderson had gone. He knew they would find the body soon, so he fled and went to Red Cloud and hopped on a train. As he fled, the body was found, and shortly thereafter, the Harlson family was also found. The news reached those on the train. If Richards is on the train, he is a damn fool if he don't get off, declared a passenger, not knowing Richard sat nearby. The conductor even sat with Richard, and the pair talked about the murders. And so while this is going on, the community in Kearney County, again, Peter is a bachelor homesteader, Swedish immigrant, has a lot of support from the wider Swedish community, and so someone pays for a tombstone, which is due south of town. If you just go all the way south, go over the railroad tracks when you hit the ethanol plant, this is where it's at, and it's unusual because it has the cause of death, right? You don't see that many tombstones that say murder. And it's kind of tucked away back at the back of the cemetery. And so there's a funeral that's held, and curiously, this is the only grave for any of the victims that has been located. It's unclear where the Harlson family went. More likely than not, due to the advanced time that they had been in the field, they were buried at the homestead, and so there's no marker to them. Richards, meanwhile, goes to Ohio and enjoys his life. He was concerned about being discovered, so he did carry a pair of revolvers with him. I was not back there long when one day, while in the company of 2 young ladies, on our way to attend a party, I was arrested. Richard was detained by a captain. He was an Indiana cavalry officer during the Civil War, David Anderson, the first sheriff in Buffalo County, and S.L. Martins, the sheriff in Adams County. They had gone east, hearing rumor that Richards had fled, and finally tracked him down to Steubenville, Ohio. The pair then transported him back to Nebraska for trial, and news of his passage west was relayed to local papers, When the trio passed through Grand Island, the paper reported that, quote, Richards was asleep at the time of the arrival of the train, and we did not get a chance to say anything to him about his horrid butcheries. In Grand Island, Sheriff Anderson received an urgent telegram from his wife, Margaret, that a mob was forming at the Kearney Depot with a noose hung over the telegraph pole. So Sheriff Anderson told his wife to meet them at Buda with a team of fast horses and a buggy. And this is a story that was related by their youngest son, Hector, who would continue to kind of tell the family story and embellish it a little bit, because as he continues to tell the story, the names get wrong, as we'll see. She met Richards and the train at Buda, and Richards was shackled to their wagon, his feet to the iron footrest and his hands to the side of the seat. The crew tried to get the Buda telegraph operator to send the news of the unscheduled handoff, but Sheriff Anderson threatened them with arrest if they informed the mob. The train crew then sped off, hoping to outrace the buggy, which was galloping parallel to the tracks. So you can imagine this going down what is now Highway 30. The sheriff's wife has a murderer, shackled to her wagon, and she's going as fast as she can to outrace the train. The train overshot the depot. Because you can imagine, again, just a half a block south of us where the Union Pacific office is now, the train coming in, going back down. And it gives her enough time to make it to the county jail before the mob can arrive. When the mob rushed down to the jail at the present day location of the Buffalo County Jail today, they found it surrounded by deputies with shotguns. The mob was not going to be able to take Richards. And to get a sense of what, being incarcerated in a place like this, this is an interior map. This is actually the Dawes County jail up in Chadron, but through the wonderful means of history, we have this in the archives at the Calvin T. Rand Library. And so you can kind of see fairly crude, just some cell blocks, and then there's a bathtub, and then a water closet kind of in the corner. But this is what the jail roughly would have looked like in Kearney as well. Return to Nebraska, Sheriff Martin says Richards will have a fair trial, and there's no danger of being mobbed as the people are law-abiding. But we have a few stories about Richards' time in the Buffalo County Jail, both from the contemporary press as well as later folks. The sheriff's eldest son, Charles, who was 6 at the time, liked to play deputy sheriff. And he liked to help the other deputies lock up prisoners at night. And he was typically tasked with filling up the coal stove. And mind you, by the time Richards has come back, it's January. So things are a little cold. And so leaving the door, and then they would leave the door open to heat the cells. And so while the deputies all stood around warming themselves, Richards shouted at little Charles as he's filling up the stove, "I would just as soon kill you as a rabbit." And the little 6-year-old deputy sheriff ran up into the family lodgings at the top of the jail and hid under the covers. This jail, pictured here, Hector Anderson, who is one of the last living kind of people associated with this, wrote to Mari Sandos to tell her about the Richards trial. Now, he gets the names wrong. He has a lot of details. He's not alive at the time, so he doesn't quite remember. But he does talk about how the jail at Kearney was the only safe place. And it is where a lot of folks were held. A lot of counties didn't have lockups during this time period. Sheriff Anderson himself also had issues with the infamous detainee. When moving Richards into another cell, and this is recounted in the Grand Island paper, he became sulky and refused to enter the cell. Sheriff Anderson told him if he did not walk into the room before he counted 4, he would blow his head off. 1, 2, 3, and 4 were counted. The prisoner did not move, and Anderson shot over Richards' head, which then convinced him to move into a different cell. Part of the difficulty with this story is this is happening in the late 1870s, so the newspapers are very, very fragmented. Many of the newspapers from Kearney from this period do not survive, but thankfully a lot of the stories from Kearney are reported. The Grand Island Press is much more robust, is a matter of surviving material, and so there's accounts in other Nebraska newspapers that kind of help us fill in what is not available in Kearney. Now, Nebraska law at the time said that capital offenses had to be tried where the offense had occurred. And so the trial was in Minden. at their wood-framed courthouse on the courthouse square, which remains today. And it was held before Judge William Gaslin. And Richards was only charged with the murder of Peter Anderson. He was not charged with the murder of the Harlesons. 7 witnesses testified to what they found at the Minden courthouse. This is the second Minden courthouse. This is not the courthouse where the trial was at. They had the cruder wood frame courthouse that they had stolen from Lowell as part of the kind of county seat wars of the 1870s. 7 witnesses testified to what they found at the Anderson homestead. Richards was then put on the stand and admitted to killing Anderson. Great defense. But argued it was done in self-defense after Anderson had reached for an axe during their fight. He called me a liar and I knocked him down. He got up and I knocked him down again with a hammer. He started to pick up an axe. I would not be called a liar by anybody on earth. After I knocked him down, I carried him into the cellar and covered him with coal. I killed him because he called me a liar. I hit him twice or 3 times. When handed the hammer in question by the prosecution, he identified it as the murder weapon. And so you can imagine the jury having a really tough time deliberating this, very quickly returned guilty. And Richards was sentenced to hang on April 26th, 1879. Due to the limited prison facilities, he was not transported to Buffalo County Jail. He was actually transported to the State Penitentiary in Lincoln. And there, he confessed to the 9 murders over 2 days to Dylan Prosper Ashburn, who was an acquaintance of his from Gibbon and also a former state legislator. The prison's deputy warden was present and served as a witness to everything that Richards was articulating. This confession was later edited and published as its own text. The truthfulness cannot be doubted, noted the editor, though as the day of execution approached, he thought to often soften his story. And so there was actually a pamphlet version of this that was published that is now exceedingly rare. This is the only known copy, and it's at the Library of Congress. It still got the stamp when it got sent to the Library of Congress in 1879. Wow. But they also then republished this in the Nebraska State Journal, and other newspapers around the country kind of picked it up because it was fairly unprecedented to have such an extensive, expansive confession laid out. So this is kind of an early trial of the century, if you will. And you could pick copies of it for all of 25 cents at the Grand Island newspaper office. In this confession, he says, I've killed 9 persons and I can't feel sorry for them. I only have one wish now in the world. I only have one wish now in the world, and what is that? I want to kill a preacher and a reporter. Photos were taken for the publication of the confession, as seen here, and it appeared in the State Journal. It was also published in newspapers around the country, and so this is some sense of the kind of broad-ranging. This is the Cincinnati Enquirer. This is a New York paper, and then this is a Missouri paper that are all kind of covering the trial, talking about this, and the sensational nature of this. But he gives a second confession as his execution approaches, and says that he didn't kill all of the Harlesons. Rather, Brown and a friend stayed up late drinking on November 2nd and 3rd, during which a fight between Mary Harlson, Richards, Brown, and his companion occurred. As Richards tells us, there were 9 shots fired during the 2 hours, and I fired 4 of them. And would have fired more if I'd had them, but I had nothing but a small pocket pistol, 5-shot and only 4 loads in it. This was on the morning that Mrs. Harlson was killed, but I never said that I'd done it all, nor never will say just all I know about it. So it is, again, as the gallows kind of begins to approach, he does begin to soften his story, but this doesn't really change what is going to happen. On April 26th, Richards arrived in Minden for his execution. This was the 4th legal execution in state history. Now, under state law at the time, executions had to take place where the trial occurred. So this is also the only capital offense that happens in central Nebraska. Thus, gallows were built on Minden's courthouse square, which is not part of the Christmas pageant. But could be added. Executions were also intended to be private. Okay, so even though they're being done publicly, the execution itself is supposed to be private. And so a large fence was constructed about the gallows, and only ticketed individuals could be inside the fence to actually watch what was going to happen. And so there is a surviving ticket at the State Historical Society to admit the bearer to the enclosure at Minden for the execution. Now, because he had murdered a Swedish homesteader, and Kearney County and Phelps County have large populations of Swedish homesteaders, there was a lot of anger at Richards from the Swedish community. And so 1,500 people show up on the courthouse square to see this execution. And they're not happy that there's a fence. And so the crowd becomes increasingly agitated as the execution neared and began tearing down the fence around the gallows. And this part of the execution is actually then reproduced in national magazines. This is the National Police Gazette, which is kind of like a sensationalist, true stories, true crime kind of publication. And you can see, the folks tearing it away. And among the many local kind of historical treasures is there's a diary from one of the witnesses to the execution that survives, that's at the Phelps County Historical Society in Holdridge. And so Rolf Johnson tells us that the sheriffs and the guard did all their power without resorting to violence. We finally made a break for the enclosure, and soon the boards commenced to fly. And in less than 5 minutes, three sides of the enclosure were razed to the ground. And Rolf Johnson actually injures himself in tearing down the fence, as he later tells us. With an agitated crowd and the possibility for violence, the county sheriff rode Richards around the square in an open wagon, flanked by deputized Swedish homesteaders, before delivering him to the gallows. Now, I'm also going to share with you this image. This is one of the real gruesome treasures of the Calvin T. Rand Library. The University Archives and Special Collections is an unprecedented repository of local history and community history. And we still actively collect things, locate things, and bring things in for the benefit of the community and our students. And one of those things recently acquired is the only photograph of the execution, which is a big file. And so this is a stereograph photo. So the Victorians would have their little stereographs. The photo is slightly different from the other one, so it would be a 3D image that you would share. And we know there was a photographer there that day. We know his name, Harry Hatch, who stood atop a sod house 200 yards away to shoot this photo. And more likely than not, this is looking southeast. So it's the southeast corner of the courthouse square in Minden now, which has had substantial development since then. But you can see that part of the fence has been torn away, and you can see Richards right here, preparing to meet his maker. And the massive crowd that has shown up to see this. He's then dropped through the trap door and gasps for air for about 10 minutes before finally succumbing to his death. Wow. He's then propped up in an open coffin, which the crowd passed by, and presumably Harry Hatch photographed him in. This is at the State Historical Society as well, among their kind of documentation. And this is a tin type photo. It's on a piece of metal, which is a very cheap form of photography at this time period. And you can kind of see they put like a blanket in the back to kind of help photograph it. Given the scale of the violence, his public confessions, news of Minden's role as a county seat, other things made this a really popular and kind of gruesome event. And so souvenirs were sold. So this is from the Grand Island Times that pieces of the rope are selling as souvenirs. And this is a surviving piece of the rope, again, at History, Nebraska. So there might be some more rope around town if you have a weird thing in a shoebox. Or more likely than not, the back of Pioneer Village somewhere. Now, what this story tells us is this is an unusual thing that I'm going to say. This is also a story, it's a violent story, it's a gruesome story, it's also a story of restraint, which is an unusual thing to say. But, we have this vision of the American West as a lawless space. But Richards wasn't subject to extrajudicial violence. There was a mob, but they did not hang him. The law worked. Law enforcement worked, right? The way that this process should happen worked. As my colleague Mark Ellis has written, he's a legal historian of the American West, in his study of Lincoln County, of North Platte, that Nebraskans during this time period did what was most familiar. They followed the letter of the law. They had no experience in extrajudicial methods. Few, if any, had ever shot or hanged another person, and most had probably never been part of an extrajudicial mob. So the Buffalo County, in the Kearney County and the Nebraska legal system worked. That this incredibly gruesome crime, that they did not respond by lynching him from a telegraph pole outside the train depot, half a block south of us. And this story also tells us about the state of law enforcement in this time period. I spent a lot of my time in the back of Trails and Rails going through boxes. And this is the county expenses for 1879 and 1880. This is what Buffalo County is expected to expend while this is going on. And you can actually see that the expenses for the sheriff have doubled in 1879. More likely than not, this is not an itemized list, unfortunately, but more likely than not due to the trial and the cost of deputizing folks and taking care of Richards and what it required. It also tells you how much the county budget is $15,000 in 1879. So Buffalo County really run on a budget during this time period. So much so, okay, that there's extra money that is allocated towards the sheriffs in 1879, that the state legislature has to actually pass a bill to pay the Adams County and Buffalo County sheriff to comp them for going to Ohio and bringing back Richards. But this is also part of the confusion with this case, is they give the wrong name. Samuel Dee Richards in the state of Nebraska, the common church of Carlson. Now, this isn't also to say that there wasn't other weird extrajudicial stuff going on at this time period, because we know from a surviving witness to these things who told this story in the 1940s, that Richards is put in a coffin, he's buried and guarded for one night. And the next evening, his body was dug up and brought to an abandoned building west of Minden. And there, unknown, but presumably well-connected people, presumably the sheriff, the judge, some of the jury, local businessmen, whoever, had an autopsy because they wanted to figure out why he was evil. Okay. And this is where it gets weird. So the town fathers of Minden have executed him, they have buried him, and again, we know the section in the quarter where this happened, we know where the abandoned building was. We don't know where the body went. So this is why I'm also calling on you, members of the community. And there's much debate. The Grand Island Times tells us that he's been wired together and is now attracting the attention of all who visit Minden. So there's one part of this history that says there's a skeleton somewhere in Minden that's wired up. Maybe it's at the high school, maybe it's in the back of Pioneer Village. That is Stephen Dee Richards. So that's one part of the story, possibly. Okay. People in Minden, understandably, are not happy about this. Our exchanges are having a good deal to say about Richards' body being resurrected, boned, and his skeleton being bleached with lime and neatly wired. But a few days ago, the most of his bones were bleaching in a manure pile not more than 100 miles from our office. Every now and then, the doctor can be seen busily engaged in scraping a bone. 100 miles under Minden, that he's in hell. The doctor is the devil. That's where he's at. Now, that doesn't actually respond to the claim of where the body is. This is more of a metaphysical answer, a theological answer, not where actually is the skeleton. But the people in Minden are obviously touchy about whatever happened to the skeleton. It's also said that the Adams County Sheriff has the skeleton in his office. Okay, and this is later. This isn't September. This is sometime later. So maybe it's at the Hastings Museum. It's unclear where he went. Now, there's another story, and this is the one that's actually told the most. And this is 1883. This is well after. He's been dead for 4 years. That his skull is in the office at the Minden Gazette on display on a little pillow. So I don't know if the Courier inherited stuff from the Gazette, if it's still there. But again, there's continuing. This is 4 years later. There's this idea that the body is floating around, that it's a spectacle that's part of display. Now, this continues in local lore. Kind of Richards, his evil nature. People continue to talk about it in Kearney County and in central Nebraska. As we saw, there are people in the 1950s writing to Mari Sandos, telling this story. There are people in the 1930s and 1940s documenting what they remember as folks who actually witnessed this begin to pass away. But what they underscore consistently across is how evil he is. And so this is one of the last references in a Kearney County paper to Richards, where there's a young girl, she's about 4 years old at the time, and she shares that she asked her mothers if she thought Richards went straight to heaven. The mother said she did not know. And the daughter responded, well, if he did go straight to heaven, he has got God killed by this time. So this is 1887. This is almost a decade after. And this is how the local community is indicating how evil he is, that he is killing God. Okay. So with that, I'm happy to take questions, but I also want to put the call out again. If anybody has a weird skull floating around, or has some idea, this is something that probably needs to be relocated somewhere better. But I want to thank, these are all of the institutions that have provided the photographs, as well as the research materials that put this together. This is a story that's spread across all sorts of different repositories around central Nebraska and the nation. And they have been more than accommodating for my frequent requests about a very gruesome tale. So with that, I'm happy to entertain questions.
Did he have any family?
He talks about the mother. As far as I've been able to tell, no. I haven't been able to locate any sort of birth record yet, just because there's no birth certificates. It'd be a baptismal record or a census record. And I haven't found anything else about that. And there's no indication in the press that he has any family ties, beyond a fiance at one point in time.
Yeah. Well, if you found the skull, you would need some family member to connect to. I don't know if there'd be any DNA left. But.
Yeah, there might be. I mean, we've got the news a little bit with that. Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah.
What piqued your curiosity to do this? This is not something one runs across.
No. So I spent a large portion of my childhood in the waiting room at my father's law firm, and we used to have all of the county judges, district judges, around the waiting room, and Judge Gaslin was in there. And so when I kind of came upon this story and I saw Judge Gaslin, I was like, oh, that's the hanging judge. So that kind of is what pieced this together. But also this interest in how the legal system is working around here. This is a different story of the West. This is also happening at the same time, actually the same month as the more famous Ketchum-Mitchell killings in Custer County, where the two homesteaders are killed by cattle ranchers and hung and incinerated. And one of those bodies is buried in our cemetery. And that's the more popular story about the violence and the West that is told in the community. This one's a little more a bit of a curiosity. It's also infuriating because of the really both simultaneously really great stuff and then very fragmented kind of record of trying to piece together this puzzle.
I I saw the olives were mentioned in this. Is it the time of the olive gang? as
Yep,
well?
yep, that same month, it's December 1878, when those events also happened. So there's a lot going on in central Nebraska, yeah, in this time period, yeah.
I'm originally from Hastings, and I remember there was a lynching there of some murderers about that same time. Do you know if there was any connection with well, I'm thinking the sheriff.
Mhm.
The sheriff then, the same sheriff?
Could you repeat the question?
That there were lynchings in Hastings at the same time period, executions, and if that's related to the same county sheriff.
Yeah, evidently a crowd broke into the jail and took the suspects out and hung them on a railroad trestle.
And that's a much more common kind of response to extrajudicial violence, yeah. It could have been the same sheriff. I've not actually really kind of poked around the Adams County Historical Society in regards to this, but it could certainly be related. Most of the sheriffs, county sheriffs in Nebraska, like on their website, they'll have a list of everybody who's served, kind of as sheriff, and it depends, depending on whether it's a political appointee or other kinds of things about when folks kind of become sheriff during this period. But very well could be Sheriff Martin. Yeah, that's something I'd have to look into. Yeah, Carol?
2 questions. Did they say anything about what they found in the autopsy or what they were expecting to find or hoping to find?
No, they do when he's in prison, they do a phrenology exam
Okay.
on him, to kind of see if the lumps in his skull make him a killer. But the only evidence, the only indication of the autopsy is the recollections of a child from that time period. That he gives, it's actually in the Heroes Without Medals, the history of Kearney County, which certainly there's a copy in the genealogy section downstairs, that he talks about. This unnamed child says, I remember that they dug up the body, they went to this building, this is where it was located. Doesn't say anything about what they find. It's not in the paper, but the Minden papers during this time period are also fairly spotty, which they might have put something into it. So unless another diary shows up or, unclear.
And the second question is, do you know anything about what happened to the hired hand? Did he ever
Nope, he just
testify?
disappeared,
Just disappeared.
as transient workers are to
Good
in this period.
choice.
Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, do you know the section in township where that farm was?
The Keene farm?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, it's, well, I was gifted the map.
Sherman
this-
6.
Yep.
Sherman 6, very good, thank you.
Somebody remembers.
Nathan, where is that marker? I know you said,
Oh, the tombstone?
yes, where is?
So it's, is it what, Bethany Lutheran? It's right
Yes.
south?
Bethany
Yes.
Lutheran, south of the TV station.
Mhm. You just go over the railroad tracks.
And that's at Keene?
No, it's,
About 2 east of Axtell.
yeah,
Okay.
Right south on 44.
yeah, and it's,
Highway 6,
it's-
first church there.
it's the back of the cemetery, kind of back there. You can't miss it, because it's off kind of by itself a little bit in the back, and then it says murdered.
That's the church behind the tombstone.
Right.
Directly behind the tombstone is the church.
And that's a key?
No, that is.
No, Axtell, west of Axtell.
Yeah.
East of Axtell.
East of Axtell.
When Richards was buried that day, was he in the Minden cemetery?
No, he was just buried outside of town.
Outside of town?
Yeah, he was just buried outside of town, and they put a deputy to sit there for the night. Yeah.
Do they know roughly, I read where they followed the railroad tracks when he spent the night along the river and woke the guy up and then killed him. Do they know where that's at all?
No, I mean, part of the difficulty, the only geographic identification for a lot of the stuff is what he is saying. And the river, that area has changed significantly because of flooding and stuff. So like, there's a rough kind of way where he'll pinpoint, he'll say like, I'm so far from Lowell, or I'm so far from Town, but not anything specific, like that there would be a campsite that can be identified or something, unfortunately.
When he hung there for 10 minutes, they didn't do it very efficiently. Did they get better?
Yeah, this is the thing, we actually do have, again, it's in the Heroes Without Medals book, someone at some point had a receipt for everything that was required for the execution, so we know the rope cost like $3 and they paid so-and-so to be the hangman. Yeah, but they're not used to it. This is part of the thing, that they don't know how to do it. They're not professionals, they're not hanging people with regularity, and so when the shift to the penitentiary for capital punishment, you do have a professionalization of capital punishment. So yeah, so he suffocates. I mean, his neck probably broke with the drop, and then he's just suffocating until he's incapacitated. Any other questions? Otherwise, thank you all for coming to a very